Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me in the back there. My name is Rasmus Gabrielson. I'm the CEO and manager of North Canterbury Fish and Game. I whakapapa back to Scandinavia. I came here in '98 as a tourist, and I've been working for the last 20 years with wild rivers, recreational angling, and fish and wildlife management. I was asked by Sonny and the organizing committee to give a talk on recreational angler use of braided rivers. And I thought this was a good opportunity to highlight what fishermen and fish values we have in these big braided rivers. We talk a lot about birds, we talk a lot about the terrestrial stuff, but often we don't talk maybe enough about the feeding cornerstones, the keystone species, the fish that feed these birds, and the kind of cornerstone species that make these such a valuable living environment. So we're going to talk a bit about that today and the recreational anglers that use them. I think this talk is a good way to illustrate the connection and effort that anglers and humans have with these rivers from a different angle, and the amount of time and connection that people have with these rivers. Fish and Game is the statutory management agency that manage sport fish and game birds in New Zealand, and we are about 30 years in the making, having inherited our responsibilities from acclimatization societies. Mostly it's introduced species, but we obviously work a lot with the habitats and the ecosystem health and the values. So braided rivers, what an amazing place, right? The ever-changing nature of these braided rivers are a real marvel. And when you head up into the headwater basins in the wintertime, you see the snow-capped mountains, and it really makes you feel alive. It makes you feel really special. And I guess no matter what angle you come from, there's so much to value here. From an angling perspective, these rivers hold an enormous amount of value, and the big braided rivers along the east coast, especially in Canterbury here, from the Waitaki to the Clarence Waitoa, are particularly important to recreational angling values. Although most of the people that fish them will be targeting species like salmon and sea-run brown trout and whitebait, many of the families and people involved with these activities have connections that span generations with the fishing hut communities at the mouth, with the big sections of braided rivers across the plains, and with the headwater spring creeks and wetlands that are the source for many of these migratory species. And when you talk to them and work with them, like I have for the last 20 years, you get struck time and time again by their passion, by their close connection to the surroundings, not just the fish. The trout and salmon, there's a sea-run trout on the right-hand side there, they are also a really good indicator for how these rivers are faring. They are very dynamic in their natures, these rivers, and many of the fish species here, introduced or native, they depend on those stable side channels, both in the headwaters and along the river and in the lower river, for feeding and protection during flood, during their juvenile phases. And everything, the thriving abundance of fish life, is built on that food web from the bottom up, the bullies, the smelt, the invertebrates. And so if they are healthy, the top predators like trout, salmon, longfin eels will show that as a flow-on effect. And so they're very good indicators. And of course, trout have been used particularly as a useful species for resource management setting over the last couple of decades, for flow protection, for discussions around development and management of rivers. And it certainly elicits a lot of passion. Recreational anglers are quite a numerous group in New Zealand, an active outdoor group. And when you see posts like this early season with the salmon on the left here, you can quite quickly have over 17,000 views within 24 hours that are all interested in seeing what is the condition of the first arriving salmon of the season. Is the size, the numbers better than previous years? Is this going to be the year of the big fish that I'm going to catch and take home to my family? And it's such a strong connection that whenever the years are not so favorsome, people get really, really emotionally involved, really interested in what is driving these changes. We manage these species from a wild management perspective, and of course they're absolutely essential that they're connected to their habitat. In my role as the manager for a fish and game region, myself and the staff, we work from the lower river Hapua around the mouth of the fishery to the headwaters where the spring creeks are, and we survey both anglers and the fish populations and the habitats across that. We're involved in compliance work, but mostly also in monitoring both the fish and the users. And it's particularly the users that we want to talk about today. We carry out our work, obviously netting fish, and this is a photo from our recent collaboration with ECAN, DOC, local Runanga, and interested volunteers on the smelt study and the lower Hapuas and other fish communities. And that's a really good baseline, but so are the humans. What do humans do? What do we see? What is their perceptions of the environment? And when recreational anglers are out there, they will not just be enjoying the environment as a good day out and catching a fish for a feed. They'll also, because they have these multi-generational connections, they'll also be thinking about how is this river stacking up to my memories from my childhood, to my father's stories, to my grandfather's stories. And so this is a lot of discussion in those big hut communities around what is the fishery today? What is it like tomorrow? What was it like in past decades? And what's driving these changes? Everybody wants to see a nice, big, healthy fish caught, whether it's a salmon, trout, or large number of whitebaits. That's what they're doing it for. But time and time again, the perception surveys come out to tell us that it's much more than that. They are really connected to and wanting a thriving, healthy environment. And of course, that permeates our management philosophy, just like so many other of the organizations speaking today about how we perceive the environment. One of the most important places for us is the absolute headwater creeks that create the salmon. This is the Upper Rakaya, Manuka Point, nice network of spring-fed streams running out of a BRaid plain wetland. And of course, the fish, in this case, a salmon, but it could equally well be a longfin eel or a torrent fish. They're a product of their whole environment. So if the whole environment is connected, the mosaic of ecological networks and connections are bonded, then everything is healthy. And if you get a break in that chain, quite quickly you see something is wrong. And I guess that's going to lead me into my talk on data sets. So I'm going to talk to you for a bit about recreational angler use. Now, we have a lot of families. Here's Reese Adams on the riverbank having a cup of tea and taking a break from fishing. And this is a great way to get young kids into the outdoors, get connected to the environments, revive and recharge yourself. And every 7 years, Fish and Game conduct a national angler survey. We've been doing this for the last 30 years. It's a national data set started in '94, and we're just about to complete the 5th data set. We're analyzing it right now from the 21-22 survey. It's a very large effort. It was built on some pilot surveys from the 1970s and 80s by a scientist at NIWA here in Christchurch, Martin Unwin and others, and they've done an enormous work for the country, really, putting a great data set in place. If you're not familiar with it, check it out online. If you're Googling angling surveys, they'll come up. They're a real source of information on how much use these rivers have from an angling perspective. The whole purpose of it is to estimate the number of angler days or number of visits we have to different rivers, lakes and rivers. We do it nationally all across the country so you can get a benchmark. And what I want to lift out today is the braided rivers in Canterbury. And these rivers, time and time again, have come out to be really nationally significant. So I've just thrown up a table here of the largest 8 East Coast, South Island salmon fisheries. There are obviously salmon in many other rivers, but this is just to highlight the big areas. If you go from the north here, from the Clarence all the way down to the Waitaki, and then we actually have the Clutha at the bottom. But anyway, you can see here that big rivers like the Waimakariri, the Rakaia, they have a total amount of about 45 to 60,000 angler days a year. So that's the number of visits that somebody goes there fishing. Now, there might have been a 3-hour fishing trip, or it could have been a whole day, 8 to 10-hour fishing trip. We don't differentiate that, but we count the number of visits. And of course, with braided rivers, you're really committing to going there. You might have a short visit for a couple of hours if you live at the huts down the river mouth and you're just going out morning and evening and having a go at trying to catch a salmon or a trout for tea. But if you're going to the middle sections or the headwaters, it's a full day or a multi-day trip. Now, over time, we've looked at how people have used these rivers, and we kind of tend to split it in the effort on trout fishing versus salmon fishing. We look at different rivers between them, and the error estimates here are standard errors. So obviously these are based on rigorous phone surveys designed by NIWA. And what pops out time and time again is just how big and important the salmon are. It's difficult to think of another recreational fishing species in freshwater, probably apart from whitebait, that elicits so much interest and response and activity as salmon in Canterbury. It really is the absolute pinnacle of what recreational anglers talk about. However, salmon are far and few between sometimes, and behind this has always been a very stable sea-run trout fishery that was really benefiting from the large abundance of smelt. And in our new surveys now, this is just lifting out the 3 biggest braided rivers for the last 4 survey periods. In our new survey right now, which we're currently analyzing, we're seeing a large decline across most of these rivers, somewhere around half of that long-term average angler use. And this has obviously triggered quite a lot of question about what might be driving this. Now, we're not completely finished with the survey yet, so I haven't put up the actual estimated numbers, but let's assume that they are probably slightly less than half in the long-term average. And this has prompted us to ask the question, what is it that's made people all of a sudden not go fishing so much? One of the key things here is that for a long time, the fishing community has been telling us that things have been changing. They have told Fishing Game, ECAN, and others that they're worried about observing declining numbers of native fish, particularly smelt, which is the cornerstone of the food chain. They're observing declining numbers of braided river birds. They're really worried about the lack of feeling like the river is thriving, and particularly the lower end of the rivers, the hapua, the lower parts of the braids. That's important spawning habitats. They're not seeing the life that they used to see just 1 or 2 decades ago. This prompted ECAN to commission a survey by NIWA to look into the perceptions of this change. And it was carried out by Don Gelliman, esteemed fishery scientist, now retired at NIWA. And he interviewed river users that had multi-decade connections to it. And obviously a large number of them were anglers, whitebaiters and fishermen, particularly salmon fishermen, the people that live in these hut communities or have connections to these fishing hut communities and have had grandfather, father themselves, their sons, grandkids connected to it. And the key points that kept being brought up time and time again here is that the perception is that the river has insufficient flows in the lower river. There's a declining water quality that is periphyte and growing in places that you didn't see it before. There's siltation happening, and it just doesn't feel healthy anymore. And of course, changes to the shape of the river mouth comes into this with less base flow. And all of that is perceived to have really changed the health of it. And the author here, Don, commented in the report, which I really recommend. If you haven't seen it, check it out, available online, or email me and I'll get you a copy. He commented that many of the people he interviewed, it was almost like they were writing a eulogy about the loss of a loved one, right? This is such a strong connection to the river, to the fishery, to the space that they're using, far beyond the need of getting food for the table. It's more about being part of that connection. And when I go and visit with local Runanga and I talk to mana whenua around our work, we hear this time and time again, that strong connection. It's great to see that. So how true are these perceptions? Well, it's really interesting that one of the things that we can quantify is what people fish with. They tend to throw out a piece of metal with a hook on it to catch these fish. And the change in the weight of the lures over the last decade or so really demonstrate quite well what has been happening in our rivers. People used to use, the old norm was using something around 22 to 28 grams, around an ounce, which was the magical number for most of your salmon fishing. And expert anglers that we talked to used to catch most of their fish on those bigger, heavier salmon lures around an ounce because they get down quickly in the big braided rivers just as the river clears when the fish are attracted in from the ocean. And we haven't really looked at this in a way. We have very little data, if you look at the environmental monitoring data, what's actually happened to these big, large, dynamic environments, because they're difficult to monitor. So the last piece here is, if you look at salmon fishing, it's a good indicator of river change and the use of recreational anglers change. Lots of it has been written on salmon angling, and in '97, a former manager of North Canterbury Fish and Game, Ross Millichamp, wrote the one book to end them all, Salmon Fever, and there was nothing more to be said. He really nailed it. However, in just 15 years, so many things had changed in these rivers that he had to write a complete rewrite of this book, including all the tips on how to fish and what to use. And I guess it really exemplifies to me that we have hit a time where these rivers are being asked to deliver water for economic use outside of the rivers, to the point where we're now seeing recreational angler change really hitting us from having been pretty stable at 20, 40, 60,000 angler days a year to maybe coming down to half. And we really haven't invested in the monitoring and the management to understand the impacts. So with that, thank you very much.